Thanks for swimming out here on a rainy night. It's good to see you all. A lot of old friends in the audience and new ones too, I'm sure. Well, we're going to talk about the life and career of General Westmoreland. So I feel obliged to warn you at the outset, this is not a happy story. But I think it is an important one, maybe even an essential one. My contention is that unless and until we understand William Childs Westmoreland, we'll never fully understand what happened to us in Vietnam or why. And Westmoreland's is overwhelmingly a Vietnam story. His involvement in the Vietnam War was the defining aspect of his life. He himself perceived that and was driven for the rest of his days to characterize, explain, rationalize, and defend that role. His memoirs reflect the fixation. In a long career, totaling 36 years as an officer in a string of postings to increasingly important assignments, the 4 years he spent commanding American forces in Vietnam and the aftermath constitute virtually the entirety of his account. All the rest, a meager tenth. Understanding Westmoreland is not easy. He turns out to be a surprisingly complex man, fueled by ambition, driving himself relentlessly, of impressive military mien, energetic and effective at self-promotion, and skillful at cultivating influential sponsors from his earliest days of service. He led his contemporaries, was admired and advanced by his seniors, and progressed rapidly upward. But few who served with him would claim they really knew this distant and difficult man. General Walter Kirwan, known to many of those present tonight, was Westmoreland's chief of staff for over a year in Vietnam. And he recalled that, although they worked very closely together, seeing each other many times during the day and going over to his quarters with things to be dealt with at night, he and Westmoreland never had a personal relationship, said General Kirwan, who was then a two-star general. And in fact, he said, they never even had a normal conversation, as two colleagues ordinarily would. You couldn't get to him, friendship, and that kind of thing, Kirwan remembered. Westmoreland had an extraordinary capacity for polarizing the views of those who encountered him. Few remained indifferent. His executive officer, when Westmoreland was Army Chief of Staff, described him as the most gracious and gentlemanly person with whom I ever served. And an executive officer to Westmoreland in Vietnam, an officer of another service, regarded him as the only man he ever met to whom the term great could be applied. There were others, though, many others, who had a darker view. Among the most prominent was General Harold K. Johnson, a man of surpassing decency and goodwill. I don't happen to be a fan of General Westmoreland's, said Johnson. I don't think I ever was, and I certainly didn't become one as a result of the Vietnam War or later during his tenure as Chief of Staff of the Army. And a general officer of another service who served closely with Westmoreland in Vietnam described him as awed by his own magnificence. Westmoreland was born and raised in semi-rural South Carolina near Spartanburg, where his father was manager of a textile mill. An Eagle Scout at age 15, president of his high school senior class, first captain at West Point, Westmoreland was encouraged from his earliest days to think of himself as specially gifted and specially privileged. His father wrote to Westmoreland during his plebe year at West Point, and he said, "You do not know how happy and proud it makes us all to know that you are making good. Even the small boys and the Negroes are interested and proud of it." And then he wrote to him not long later and said, "When you need anything, write me and I will send it to you. There is nothing too good for you." And a subsequent letter, still during Westmoreland's plebe year at West Point, went even further. "The people here," said his father, "the people here, white and black, think you are about the biggest man in the country. Roosevelt has no rank at all compared to you. They really believe you will be president of the U.S. someday and talk this among themselves." Westmoreland entered World War II as commander of an artillery battalion in the 9th Infantry Division, taking his unit into combat in North Africa. There they performed with distinction, earning a Presidential Unit Citation. Subsequently in Sicily, Westmoreland served temporarily under then Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor, Division Artillery Commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, an association that would be extremely important to Westmoreland throughout the remainder of his career. For the rest of World War II, Westmoreland was a staff officer. When the fighting was over, although he was an artillery officer, he was given command of an infantry regiment for 6 months in the Army of Occupation. Back in the United States, Westmoreland was able to get an assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division where, after attending jump school, he had a year in command of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment and then 3 years as Division Chief of Staff of the 82nd Airborne. Late in the Korean War, Westmoreland took command of the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, a unit that constituted the Theater Reserve, and consequently was stationed in Japan and periodically deployed to Korea. Westmoreland commanded the outfit for 15 months, of which 9 months were spent in Japan, where, after he was promoted to Brigadier General, he was able to live with his wife Kitsy and their young first child, and 6 months in Korea. During one such Korean deployment, when they were not in combat, Westmoreland, who desired to qualify for the Master Parachutist's badge, made 13 jumps in one day. After the war, and some scheming on Westmoreland's part, the Koreans awarded the 187th their Presidential Unit Citation. Now, new Brigadier General Westmoreland experienced his first Pentagon duty with an assignment in personnel. "I had not served there earlier," he said in an oral history, "and I didn't want to serve there. But then Maxwell Taylor became Army Chief of Staff and rescued Westmoreland from the personnel policy morass, making him his Secretary of the General Staff. 2 years later, having in the meantime been promoted to 2-star rank, Westmoreland was rewarded by Taylor with command of the 101st Airborne Division. Things moved quickly for him after that. 2 years as division commander were followed by a three-year assignment as superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point, and then promotion to lieutenant general. Basically, he was sheep-dipped, just 6 months in command of the 18th Airborne Corps, and the 3-star promotion, setting him up for what was to come. Westmoreland was sent to Vietnam in January 1964 as deputy to General Paul Harkins. Then in June 1964, he succeeded him as commander, U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, the start of a 4-year stint in that post. Beginning in the spring of 1965, the United States began deploying ground forces to Vietnam. Under Westmoreland, who had decided to conduct a war of attrition, these forces concentrated almost entirely on large unit search and destroy operations, as they were called, conducted primarily in the deep jungle. Fixated on these large unit operations, called by many the War of the Big Battalions, Westmoreland largely ignored other key responsibilities, most importantly, upgrading South Vietnam's armed forces and dealing with pacification. His way of war did nothing to affect the situation in South Vietnam's hamlets and villages where the enemy's covert infrastructure was left free to continue using terror and coercion to dominate the rural populace. Meanwhile, Westmoreland deprived the South Vietnamese of modern weaponry, giving U.S. and other Allied forces priority for issue of the new M16 rifle and other advanced military wherewithal. The South Vietnamese thus went for years equipped with cast-off World War II vintage U.S. equipment while being outgunned by the communists, who were provided the AK-47 assault rifle, one of the great infantry weapons of all time, and other advanced equipment by their backers. It's very important to know the next thing I'm going to tell you, and a lot of people don't know it, and that is that Westmoreland, as commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, was left to devise his own approach to conduct of the war. The conventional views of the war, even now, are that it was micromanaged from Washington. There are many stories of how, at Lyndon Johnson's Tuesday lunches in the White House, he and other, mostly civilian, top officials would even select and approve individual bombing targets in North Vietnam. Those stories are true, but they had to do with actions taken outside South Vietnam. Within South Vietnam, the U.S. commander had very wide latitude in deciding how to fight the war. This was true for Westmoreland and equally true for his eventual successor. This was not, General Bruce Palmer Jr. concluded, a good thing. There were many weaknesses, said Palmer, in this strategy, which in numerous interrelated ways played into the hands of the enemy. For one, he said, chasing around the countryside was futile. General Philip Davidson, who served as Westmoreland's chief intelligence officer, said that Westmoreland's interest always lay in the big unit war. Said Davidson, pacification bored him. And said Davidson, the search and destroy operations favored by Westmoreland accomplished little in providing the secure environment which pacification required. The measure of merit in a war of attrition was body count. Westmoreland's belief was that if he could kill enough of the enemy, they would lose heart, cease their aggression, go back to North Vietnam, and the South would be saved. Westmoreland, unfortunately, underestimated the enemy's staying power. Instead of giving up when they suffered grievous casualties, they proved willing to absorb these and still keep fighting, making up the losses time after time, and thus the progress Westmoreland claimed in racking up huge body counts did nothing to win the war. The enemy simply kept sending more and more replacements to make up his losses. Westmoreland was on a treadmill. Westmoreland also overestimated the American people's patience and tolerance of friendly losses. On a visit to South Vietnam, Senator Hollings from Westmoreland's home state of South Carolina was told by Westmoreland, "We're killing these people, the enemy, at a ratio of 10 to 1. Said Hollings, Westy, the American people don't care about the 10. They care about the 1. But Westmoreland never got it. Westmoreland's response to any problem was to request more troops. The result was buildup of a U.S. contingent of ground forces, soldiers, and Marines that eventually reached well over 500,000 men. But when the troop requests kept coming, with no evident progress in winning the war, Washington's patience finally ran out. In the spring of 1967, Westmoreland asked for 200,000 more troops, but got only a fraction of that amount. At the time, he stated publicly that he was delighted with the outcome, but in his memoirs decided instead that he had been extremely disappointed. Later still, on the witness stand in a libel suit he brought against CBS television, he changed his stance again and said he had not been extremely disappointed. In response, the CBS attorney read from Westmoreland's own book, extremely disappointed, forcing him to recant. And then when, in the wake of the enemy's 1968 Tet Offensive, Westmoreland claimed a great victory and then asked for another 206,000 troops, a request he then spent years denying he had ever made, he got just token forces and was soon on his way home. It is very clear that Westmoreland thought he could take the war over from the South Vietnamese, bring it to a successful conclusion, then hand their country back to the South Vietnamese and go home in glory. But he could not do that. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker saw that this was the case, concluding that when the United States first got involved, the political and psychological aspect of the war was not understood, and he said, because we didn't understand it, our military thought we could get in and do the job and get out much more quickly than proved to be the case. I think, said Bunker, that's one reason we were slow in training the Vietnamese instead of starting really to train them in an intensive way when we first got there. We didn't begin to train the Vietnamese with the objective of their taking over from us until General Abrams got there. This disparity in resources, especially weapons, persisted throughout Westmoreland's tenure in Vietnam. Ambassador Bunker noted it in a reporting cable to the President on 29 February 1968, only weeks before Westmoreland's departure after his 4 years there. Said Bunker to the President, the enemy has been able to equip his troops with increasingly sophisticated weapons. They are in general better equipped than the ARVN forces, a fact which has an adverse bearing on ARVN morale. He might have also said it had an adverse bearing on ARVN's performance and reputation. By the time Bunker rendered this judgment, Westmoreland had been in command of U.S. forces in Vietnam for nearly 4 years. Another American ambassador during that period, Westmoreland's longtime patron, General Maxwell Taylor, was even more blunt. We never really paid attention to the ARVN Army, he said. We didn't give a damn about them. 1967 was a fateful time in Westmoreland's Vietnam service. 1968, the year of the enemy's Tet Offensive, is usually regarded as the watershed point in the war. 1967 was also a fateful time. During 1967, Westmoreland made 3 trips to the United States, where in public appearances he gave very optimistic assessments of how the war was going. This formed part of what later began to be called the Johnson administration's Progress Offensive. Very, very encouraged, said Westmoreland in a plainside press conference upon arriving in the U.S. in mid-November 1967. I've never been more encouraged, he said, during my entire almost 4 years in country. At the National Press Club, he asserted, "We have reached an important point where the end begins to come into view." And he added, "The enemy's hopes are bankrupt." On another visit that same year, he spoke to a joint session of Congress, rendering another optimistic report and being so taken with the experience that he later described it as the most memorable moment in his military career and his finest hour, which gave him the greatest personal satisfaction. I must say, I find it very sad that a famous officer who rose to the top ranks of his profession found a political event the most memorable in his career. 1967 was also a time of vigorous debate over the enemy's order of battle, meaning his strength and organization. Westmoreland denied senior civilian officials accurate data by imposing a ceiling on the number of enemy forces his intelligence officers could report or agree to, and then by personally removing from the order of battle entire categories that had for long been included, thus falsely portraying progress and reducing enemy strength. By May of 1967, President Johnson was referring to the war as a bloody impasse. And military historian Russell Weigley commented succinctly on LBJ. "No capable war president," he wrote, "would have allowed an officer of such limited capacities as General Westmoreland to head U.S. forces in Vietnam for so long." Meanwhile, Westmoreland, challenged by newsmen on his optimistic pronouncements, resorted to his familiar reliance on body count. "We are bleeding him a great deal more than he is bleeding us," said Westmoreland. Later, Westmoreland sought to portray 1967 as a triumphant year, one during which he was winning the war. Read the MACV command history for that year. 1967 was characterized by accelerating efforts and growing success in all phases of MACV endeavors. But that was not how he is or his performance were seen by others. General Bruce Palmer, Jr. was then serving as Deputy Commanding General of U.S. Army Vietnam, and he told General Abrams, when he arrived in May of 1967 to become deputy to Westmoreland, that Palmer, had basic disagreements with Westy on how it was organized and how we were doing it. And later, General Palmer elaborated on those views for journalist Mark Perry. "It was just a mess," he said. "We were losing and trying to put it together, and it just wasn't working. There wasn't anything that was working." And in late summer 1967, Ambassador Bunker submitted this assessment: "We still have a long way to go. Much of the country is still in Vesey, Viet Cong hands. The enemy can still shell our bases and commit acts of terrorism in the securest areas. VC units still mount large-scale attacks. Most of the populace has still not actively committed itself to the government, and a VC infrastructure still exists throughout the country." That was what Westmoreland had to show for 3 years of command of U.S. forces. By the end of 1967, remembered Nicholas Katzenbach, a grim sense of siege was descending on the White House. Finally, even General William Depew, architect of the first search and destroy approach to the war, admitted that it was a losing concept of operations. "We ended up," he said, after it was all over, "with no operational plan that had the slightest chance of ending the war favorably." In the face of this united opposition to his way of war, Westmoreland maintained then and later that the North Vietnamese, the enemy, in mid-1967 were in a position of weakness. This next I have to tell you is the saddest thing to come out of the years of research that have led to this book. There were many instances, especially concerning matters in Vietnam, where Westmoreland had been willing to shade or misremember or deny the record when his perceived interests were at stake. One episode involving his lack of confidence in the Marine leadership is both illustrative and revealing. Shortly before the Tet Offensive began at the end of January 1968, Westmoreland decided to send his deputy, by that time General Abrams, north to the I Corps region to establish and run there a tactical headquarters that he designated MACV Forward. From there, the deputy was to control the operations of all U.S. forces in the area, including those of the Marine Corps. Westmoreland's chief intelligence officer, who I've mentioned before, General Philip Davidson, had returned from a visit to the Khe Sanh area populated by the Marine Corps and briefed Westmoreland on the situation there. Then he said, the description of the unprotected installations and the general lack of preparation to withstand heavy concentrations of artillery and mortar fire agitated General Westmoreland. Finally, he turned to his deputy and said something to the effect that he, Westmoreland, had lost confidence in Marine General Cushman's ability to handle the increasingly threatening situation. His response was to set up MACV Forward. Marine reaction was predictable. One division commander called this the most unpardonable thing Saigon did and said Marines viewed it with shock and astonishment. Westmoreland soon held a press conference in which he denied that any loss of confidence in Marine leadership had been his reason for placing the new headquarters over them. Westmoreland also cabled Marine General Cushman, in command of Marine forces in the I Corps region, to say there has been extensive backgrounding here in Saigon with the various news bureau chiefs to point out that the establishment of MACV Forward carried no stigma whatsoever with respect to the Marines, that it was merely a normal military practice and that was only temporary. Only the temporary was true. The other denials were false, as evidenced not only by Davidson's eyewitness account, which I've just related to you, but also by a lengthy and anguished cable Westmoreland had sent contemporaneously to General Earl Wheeler, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As you perhaps appreciate, he began, the military professionalism of the Marines falls far short of the standards that should be demanded by our armed forces. Indeed, they are brave and proud, but their standards, tactics, and lack of command supervision throughout their ranks requires improvement in the national interest. And there was more. I would be less than frank, added Westmoreland in this message to General Wheeler, if I did not say that I feel somewhat insecure with the situation in Quang Tri Province in view of my knowledge of their shortcomings. Without question, many lives would be saved if their tactical professionalism were enhanced. After the war, when the Marines were writing their history of the conflict, they sent a draft of the 1968 volume to Westmoreland for comment. He marked it up so extensively and took issue with so many of the judgments rendered that he was invited to discuss the whole matter in person. He accepted, unwisely in my view, and in a session with a number of Marine Corps historians, again insisted, with regard to establishment of MACV Forward, that particular action had not a damn thing to do with my confidence in General Cushman or the Marines, not a damn thing. This was not only false, but given the existing paper trail, reckless in the extreme. Westmoreland racked up a lengthy record of false, misleading, and inaccurate statements or omissions, ranging from enemy order of battle to his troop requests, from the situation in Vietnam to closure of the Khe Sanh base, and from battles in the Ia Drang to prediction of an early end of the war to light at the end of the tunnel. Some of these matters were petty, others of crucial importance, but they were alike in one respect. When Westmoreland saw his personal interests at stake, he did not hesitate to conceal or abandon the truth. When, at the end of January 1968, the enemy's Tet Offensive began, Westmoreland's long turn at bat was nearing an end. Newsweek magazine described a devastating measure of how far he had fallen. In November, said Newsweek, when he was conjuring up the light at the end of the tunnel, he was affectionately called Westy. But by last week, in most official and unofficial briefings, he was General Westmoreland. The Tet resurgence of enemy forces, seen on television sets all over the country, led many to conclude that in his optimistic forecasts of the previous year, Westmoreland had either not known what he was talking about or he had not leveled with the American people. It is hard to know which is the more devastating criticism. What was clear, however, was that with his unavailing approach to conduct the war, Westmoreland had squandered 4 years of support for the war by much of the American people, the Congress, and even the media. For the next 4 years, Westmoreland served as Army Chief of Staff. The Army of that day was struggling with many problems, some the result of the ongoing war in Vietnam, others more societal in origin. These included indiscipline, widespread drug abuse, racial disharmony, budgetary shortfalls, and the necessity to prepare for the end of the draft and impending transition to an all-volunteer force. Faced with these multiple crises, Westmoreland decided to focus his attention elsewhere. I spoke in every state in the Union, he later recalled. I considered myself the military spokesman of the Army and that I should be exposed to the American public and put forth the Army's point of view. I felt that an understanding of the military was the primary mission that fell on my shoulders while I was Chief of Staff. As a consequence, he said, I had too much to occupy me with such things as the details of Army reorganization. I frankly, in evaluating the priorities of my time, gave rather high priority to going around the country and giving them the facts of life with respect to the military. During his 4 years as Chief of Staff, Westmoreland apparently gained no more understanding of the war than he had had when he was in Vietnam. Tom Polgar was the CIA Chief of Station, Saigon, when Westmoreland made a 1972 visit. He's still Chief of Staff. They both attended a small function at Ambassador Bunker's residence, where, said Polgar with reference to Westmoreland, I was astonished by his apparent lack of understanding of what was going on in the war, even then. In later years, Westmoreland viewed himself as very much put upon. My years away, he told a hometown audience, my years away have been fraught with challenges, frustrations, and sadness. Nobody has taken more guff than I have, he claimed, and I'm not apologizing for a damn thing. Nothing, and I welcome being the point man. That outlook, no second guessing of himself and no regrets, persisted through the end of his life. As Army Chief of Staff and beyond, Westmoreland made strenuous efforts to shape the historic record in ways favorable to his version of reality. This included writing his memoirs with the help of a ghostwriter, Kevin Buckley was formerly the Newsweek bureau chief in Saigon, and he reviewed the book, commenting that from the beginning, Westmoreland probably expected to write a memoir of victory similar to General Eisenhower's crusade in Europe. And the defeat in Vietnam had not deterred him from doing this. Wrote Westmoreland self-pityingly, "As American commander in Vietnam, I underwent many frustrations, endured much interference, lived with countless irritations, swallowed many disappointments, bore considerable criticism." Reviewing Westmoreland's book, the well-known military commentator S.L.A. Marshall concluded that Westmoreland remains the GOAT symbol of the country's most mournful misadventure abroad ever. Two major episodes, both extremely traumatic, marked the Westmoreland retirement years. First was a dramatically unsuccessful campaign for governor in his native state of South Carolina. Then there was a failed libel suit against the CBS television network for a documentary charging Westmoreland with manipulation of enemy strength figures while he commanded U.S. forces in Vietnam. In each of these cases, Westmoreland ignored the advice of highly qualified men who had his best interests at heart and who counseled against the courses of action Westmoreland took. In the political campaign, Westmoreland came in second in the Republican primary to a state senator who then went on to be elected South Carolina's first Republican governor since Reconstruction. Westmoreland said he had found it very hard to shake hands with people, to ask people for favors, and to talk about himself. Despite a campaign theme describing him as the only candidate with a proven leadership and administrative ability to carry South Carolina to greatness, Westmoreland ran a poorly managed campaign, never got out a coherent message, and wound up deeply in debt. Afterward, he called it his most humiliating experience. In 1982, CBS television aired a documentary charging Westmoreland with having manipulated reports of enemy strength during the Vietnam War. Westmoreland had willingly participated in making the program, being interviewed on camera, and oh yes, asking to be paid for doing so. The resulting broadcast was not favorable to him, with numerous former intelligence officers describing how enemy strength data had been manipulated and how Westmoreland himself had decreed that certain whole categories of enemy forces be taken out of the order of battle, thus artificially driving down the total of enemy forces so as to claim progress in his war of attrition. In due course, against the advice of high-powered attorneys, men like Stanley Resor, the former Secretary of the Army, and Cyrus Vance, a Deputy Secretary of Defense, men who had his interests at heart and who cautioned against it, Westmoreland brought a libel suit against CBS seeking $120 million in damages. Subsequent to the broadcast, it came out that the producer had committed numerous violations of CBS guidelines. The basic findings, however, were still seen as valid. In the course of a lengthy trial, with Westmoreland represented by an attorney who had never before tried a case in court, things did not go well. Still, the thing dragged on for some 18 weeks, and then, just days before the case would have gone to the jury, Westmoreland withdrew his suit. In exchange, he received a vanilla statement from CBS which he claimed exonerated him. "The effort to defame, dishonor, and destroy me," he said, "and those under my command had been exposed and defeated. I therefore withdrew from the battlefield, all flags flying." Editorial opinion, however, was not so favorable. The New York Times, speaking for many, succinctly stated the prevailing reaction. At the end, it concluded, General Westmoreland stood in imminent danger of having a jury confirm the essential truth of the CBS report, for in court, as on the original program, the general could not get past the testimony of high-ranking former subordinates who confirmed his having colored some intelligence information. Said one of the jurors to the press on the way out the courthouse door for the last time, the evidence in favor of CBS was overwhelming. One of General Westmoreland's former aides said late in his life, Westmoreland's life since Vietnam has been miserable. Westmoreland himself seemed to have contributed much to that outcome. The Vietnam War is my #1 priority, he told an interviewer some years after retirement. I've tried to spread myself thin and visit all sections of the country. But then, in an assertion completely undermining the meaning and purpose of all those years of incessant, even frantic activity, Westmoreland told a college audience that in the scope of history, Vietnam is not going to be a big deal. It won't float to the top as a major endeavor. Westmoreland's ultimate failure would have earned him more compassion, it seems certain, had he not personally been so fundamentally to blame for the endless self-promotion that elevated him to positions and responsibilities beyond his capacity. It's the aggressive guy who gets his share. Plus, Westmoreland maintained, that principle, he said, applies to most anything. And that's the way he operated. In later years, Westmoreland, widely regarded as a general who had lost his war, also lost his only run for political office, lost his libel suit, and lost his reputation. It was a sad ending for a man who for most of his life and career had led a charmed existence. General Westmoreland lived a long life, afflicted by Alzheimer's disease for at least his last decade. He died in July 2005 and was buried at West Point in a grave he had selected when he was superintendent there. As a final irony, given Westmoreland's very strong and vocal opposition to the admission of women to West Point, the cadet honor guard for his burial ceremony was commanded, and very ably, by a female cadet officer. Thank you very much. I would be happy if you would like to entertain some comments and questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, please raise your hand. We have microphones on both sides of the room, and we'll get to you. Sir, you have the first go.
Yes, sir. I was wondering if you could give us maybe some more insights from your research about General Westmoreland's tenure as commander of the 101st. I've done 2 tours at Fort Campbell, and old veterans that had settled in that area spoke glowingly of his time there, said he was the best division commander they'd ever had, and I read an interview of Rod Pascal, who was a lieutenant during that time. He said he was absolutely in his element as a division commander. So I wonder if you could give some more insight and elaboration.
Good. That's a good first question. I have a theory developed over a number of years that in the Q&A, if the first question's a good one, the Q&A will go well, and so thanks for starting us with a good one. The evaluation of General Westmoreland as commander of the 101st Airborne Division was overwhelmingly positive. At that time, not only did he think he was a great general, but the soldiers thought so too. And he was genuinely interested in the well-being of his soldiers. He was very concerned that they went off post and went to roadhouses or whatever and drank a lot of alcohol and then drove their private vehicles back, for example. And he established places on post where they could get beer cheaper, a nickel cheaper. And he'd go out to these places where the soldiers were, and he would talk to them, and he'd say, listen, guys, what are you doing out here? You could be back on the post drinking beer cheaper. And they would try to explain to him how somehow that wasn't quite the same thing. So he never really grasped that, but his heart was in the right place. And at one time he told them, he commanded for 2 years there, and this was in like a State of the Union address, let us say, but with respect to the division. He told them with great sincerity and sorrow that in the past year they had lost an infantry company's worth of soldiers in POV wrecks and accidents due to use of alcohol and things like that. And he was trying really hard to drive that down. Jim Schlesinger told me once, the former Secretary of Defense, that he had had a conversation about about General Westmoreland and this tenure at the 101st with Vernon Walters, another very well-known general. And he said, what do you think? Westy peaked at Major General? And Walters said, well, Colonel. But so, their views differ on this. But I do think it would be mean-spirited to say that his tenure in command of the 101st was less than outstanding. And I say in the book that was probably the level at which the range of responsibilities, the intellectual requirements of the job, the high degree of physical activity, the close contact with the soldiers were still well within his capacity. And only that when he was elevated to more complex situations and circumstances did his flaws become more apparent. I'll tell you one more thing about that too, because he went on, as I said just briefly, there wasn't time to cover all these assignments, he went on then to be the superintendent at West Point for 3 years. And he got a letter from the Chief of Staff. On Chief of Staff, stationery, handwritten, and it said in the first sentence, he said, very confidentially, I have recommended, the Secretary of the Army has approved that you will be sent to West Point this coming summer when the incumbent moves on. And then he feels necessary to put in a second sentence trying to assuage what he anticipated would be Westmoreland's great disappointment that this would not involve a promotion. It was to be another 2 years. So he tells him the heads of all the academies are 2-star, but he said, we think this is a very important assignment, and we think you're the best man for the job. Now, I think there's some hyperbole there, and I'll tell you why. In his long career, 36 years in the Army, the only formal instruction that General Westmoreland underwent was a 1-month course in mess management given at the Cooks and Bakers School in Hawaii when he was a lieutenant there, and parachute school after World War II. He missed out on all the stops in the Army's great series of educational opportunities. He did not go to the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. He did not go to the Army War College or any of the other war colleges here or elsewhere. And perversely, he was rather proud of that. He said sometimes, I haven't read the book. He said, so, I'm not infected by that way of conducting affairs. I thought he was a very surprising choice to head West Point because, as I just said, he'd missed out on all the Army schooling. He had also not been to graduate school. He had not had a stint as a junior officer, as an instructor at West Point, as many of his contemporaries had. And he wrote in letters to some of the people that he relied on as sponsors, some letters early on that recognized that he was not really well suited for this. I will say this: he recognized the areas that he was not an intellectual and not an academician, and he focused on details of administration and logistics to some good effect. In fact, after he left, he was there for 3 years. After he left, an officer who had known him there sent him a note. It's in his papers down at the University of South Carolina, and he says, your picture is still hanging in the printing plant at West Point. Since you're the only superintendent that ever visited the printing plant or took the slightest interest in them there, they refused to acknowledge that you were gone. And so that was okay, But I've run on a bit here, but I thought your question was quite good. And I believe it's fair to say that had General Westmoreland retired after command of the 101st Airborne Division, he would have been viewed as one of our fine soldiers, and his reputation would have remained that. It's just too bad that he was elevated to other levels. And as I said in my closing, had that not been the result to such a great degree of his own self-promotion, a lot more sympathy would have followed him, I think, than has been the case. Thanks. Anybody else? All right.
Sir, I've been to other lectures here with Vietnam in mind, like we are soldiers still, etc. And it really did come out that the North Vietnamese, the will to never quit. I mean, that's what they had.
Yes.
Is there anything in General Westmoreland's writings or comments or interviews or anything that you said that, well, maybe I was just fighting somebody that was never going to quit? Yeah.
That's a really good question, too. That's another reason, I think, why there's not more sympathy for him, because although lots of other senior officers took issue with his approach to the conduct of the war, then, not waiting till later and doing it in retrospect, but in the course of it, General Fred Wyan, General Harold K. Johnson, General William Yarborough, Bruce Palmer Jr., lots of others I could name, all said, hey, this isn't working. And when it was all over, I quoted General William Depew because he was the architect as the J3, the operations officer of MACV, of the search and destroy approach to the conduct of the war. And Depew had the integrity and the decency to say afterward, we were wrong. We never understood the tenacity of the enemy and their willingness to take these really horrifying losses and keep coming back. Westmoreland was never able to bring himself to admit that, or maybe to even understand it. I don't know which it was. And I think that cost him a great deal. And I alluded to this in giving you the one illustration about the putting MACV forward in over the Marines and how he claimed that had nothing to do with his loss of confidence in the Marines. And of course it did. And he was on record as saying that, but recklessly kept maintaining otherwise. He kept telling people in his chain of command, especially Lyndon Johnson, that we were winning. And so when pressed by how he could demonstrate that, he always fell back on body count, which, as I said, is the measure of merit in a war of attrition. But the problem was, okay, so you killed X numbers of the enemy. Let's leave aside for the moment the issue of whether the body count was reported honestly or whether that was a corrupt measure of merit. If the enemy replaces all his losses and even sometimes adds more, you haven't accomplished a thing. You've just got to go back and do it over and over again. And as I said when Senator Hollings went out and said to him what he did, the American people don't care about the 10. They care about the 1. Westmoreland had every chance to be educated on that point, but he remained impervious to it. So as far as I know, and believe me, I have spent a lot of time on this, Westmoreland never admitted that he had adopted an unavailing approach, and he was asked many times, if you had it to do over, would you do anything differently? As he left Saigon for the last time after 4.5 years there, last 4 as commander, naturally he had a press conference. He always had a press conference. And naturally they asked him, would you do anything different if you had it to do over again? And he waltzed around that a little bit, but essentially his answer was, would not. This is the way to do it. Are you want to handle this?
Good to go.
Okay. Back in the late 70s, I was teaching low-intensity conflict at Leavenworth. We came upon a reference to a statement by General Westmoreland that he kept a copy of Sun Tzu's Art of War on his bedside table. And based on our study of the war in Vietnam, and some of us who have been advisors to ARVN, We suspected that he didn't actually ever take it off the table and read it, but you've indicated that he really didn't understand. But if you come across any indication that the general tried to understand, that he did any kind of reading or study or asked his staff to provide him information that would provide him some insights into the enemy that he was fighting?
Yeah, thank you for another really good question. And let me take the back end first, and then I'll go back to how you started the question. The instances that I am most aware of where he asked his staff for input on matters relating to the conduct of the war occurred after he came back to be Chief of Staff of the Army, and he was working on simultaneously several things which I characterize as efforts to shape the story of the war as he viewed it. One major one was a report on the war in Vietnam, which he spent an enormous amount of time on. He wanted Admiral Sharp, who had been, I think, Admiral Sharp had been the think pack at the time that Westmoreland was in Vietnam. He asked Sharp to collaborate with him on this, and Sharp wouldn't do it. But he would agree to write his own piece. And so Sharp had a piece, and Westmoreland had a piece. I think we can gauge Admiral Sharp's views not only from what he says in his piece, but from later when Westmoreland writes his memoirs and he asks Sharp to give him a blurb, and Sharp turns him down. The report on the war in Vietnam, that's the title of it. And of course, this is Westmoreland in 1968-69. The war's still roaring on. The war's going to last for 6 more years, 5 of it with us in it. So it's really the report of his war in Vietnam, but he doesn't characterize it that way. He's got a series of monographs that he tasks senior general officers to write or to manage the writing of. And he's got them on practically every topic, logistics and each of the major battles and intelligence and so on. And of course, the people writing these are under his control and under his command, and they come out, pretty uncritical. The only major topic area he didn't assign a monograph on was mechanized and armor operations in Vietnam, even though General Haynes, the 4-star armor officer, had urged him to do that. So after he's gone and there's a new chief of staff, General Don Story gets the mission, and he picks it up and he writes the monograph on armored operations. It turns out to be a bestseller for the government printing office, and because it was written late, it's the only one that covers the whole war. All these others sort of end with Westmoreland's tenure. He writes his memoirs while he's a chief of staff of the Army. And I didn't say anything in the book about whether this might be illegal or unethical, because Colonel Paul Miles, who was then a major working for him, is a friend of mine, and I didn't think I wanted to raise that issue with respect to him. But Paul Miles goes out and interviews all kinds of senior generals and writes up the results of those, and that becomes fodder input for the memoirs written after Westmoreland retires. And now I'm getting to answer your question. Westmoreland tasks people in the hierarchy of the Army staff to give him input on topics that he is interested in. And I'm not sure that I can remember them all, but the one that was very interesting had to do with the 1-year tour in Vietnam. General Westmoreland was adamant that there would be a 1-year tour, and for a long time he argued that that was a really good thing. But now, getting ready, I think, to do his memoirs, he asks the Des Purs to tell him about the 1-year tour. And they send him back a sizzler. And the last line of it, which I'll paraphrase, is the 1-year tour has caused most of the problems we have in Army personnel and has persisted for at least 6 years, and we see no end to it coming. Well, that wasn't, of course, the answer but he hoped for, but that's what he's doing. He's trying to get this kind of input. I've a little lost track of where I should be going on this. Does that sort of answer? All right, thank you.
Yes, sir. You're first, and then you can.
It's both obvious and well known that Creighton Abrams recognized the need for change when he took over. If you mentioned his name other than the fact that he was the succeeding deputy and then commander, I haven't heard anything about what comments or writings he may have left behind in critique of Westmoreland. Can you speak to that at least briefly?
Yes. You didn't hear that on purpose. This is Westmoreland's book. Now, obviously, a lot of other people come into play, and I've quoted a number of them already tonight, and in the book I quote a lot more. It's very interesting to me because a lot of people comment on, well, for a long time, just about everything that was written about the war by people like Stanley Carnell and Neil Sheehan and so on, treated the war as though it were a homogeneous whole, and that it was the kind of war that we knew in the Westmoreland years. And if we've achieved anything in the last 20 years or so, I hope and believe it is that people at least recognize that the earlier years under Westmoreland and the later years under General Abrams were much, much different in almost all important respects. And most importantly, in terms of the understanding of the nature of the war, and from which then you derive a concept of how to prosecute such a war. General Abrams was not a person to go around boosting his own stock. And he didn't write much. When he was, most people here know, I think, that he also came back to be Army Chief of Staff after commanding 4 years in Vietnam, and that after only 2 years as Chief of Staff, he died in office. And they didn't think he was going to die. He had lung cancer. A lung was removed. He was recuperating. And Bruce Palmer, his close friend and classmate, they'd been young cavalry officers together after graduating from West Point, went to see him, and he said, Abe, he didn't know he was going to die then, but he thought he might have to retire. He said, Abe, you should write your memoirs. And General Abrams said, absolutely not. I'm never going to do that. And General Palmer tried to persuade him. He said, yes, they could be like Grant's memoirs, you know, modest and factual and help us learn a lot. And General Abrams said, no, I'm not going to do that. And he said, well, why is that? And he said, well, this is an old joke, but he said, too many vertical pronouns. That was not his style. But we have some things from him that tell us a lot about both how he felt about the conduct of the war and how he felt about the profession of being a soldier. General Jack Vesey, name known to many people here tonight, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said after General Abrams had been dead and many years had gone by, because people raised the issue, did General Westmoreland in only 2 years as Chief of Staff have any real effect on the Army and its future? General Vesey said, when Americans saw the great Army that fought Desert Storm, they were seeing the Abrams vision in action. He said, the equipment that worked, the use of reserve forces, the effective close air support, and above all, the great training that taught our soldiers how to stay alive on the battlefield were all seeds planted by Abe. And then many people here tonight, I know, have been at the Army War College as students or as faculty members or as visitors. And if you come out of Root Hall, right in front of you, where that circle is there, there's a statement by General Abrams. And he says, we must have an Army that has a vision and soldiers who are willing to carry out that vision, to march a little farther, to carry a heavier load, and to step out into the darkness and the unknown for the well-being of others. Well, I think that's a wonderful summation of him. Now, I guess I should just add briefly with respect to the conduct of the war. General Fred Wyan said the tactics changed within 15 minutes after General Abrams took command. And the way they changed was like this. General Westmoreland, in his fixation on the large unit operations in the War of Search and Destroy, basically neglected two other important responsibilities. One was to build up South Vietnam's armed forces so they could become more capable of taking over the responsibility for their country's security, and the other was pacification, and it's especially rooting out this covert infrastructure in the hamlets and villages. I described how he never gave the South Vietnamese any decent weapons, even though their enemy was armed with AK-47s and the best stuff the communists had and would give to them. And so when General Abrams came, he drew on a study called the Proven Study, P-R-O-V-N, which was done under the auspices of General Harold K. Johnson, who was then the Chief of Staff of the Army. And this study said, what General Westmoreland is doing is not working and cannot work, and the reason is it's having no effect on the war in the villages. And it said that the villages have to be the central point of focus of the way to fight this kind of war. General Abrams was the Vice Chief of Staff at the time, and he signed off on that study. And as soon as he got to Vietnam, General Philip Davidson is a great resource. He's gone now, but I want to tell you, I harvested him to a fairly well. He was the J2 the last year under Westmoreland and the first year under Abrams, and his ability to make comparative judgments was unparalleled. He also liked to drink martinis, which I sometimes like to do. And he lived in San Antonio, where I sort of grew up and visit pretty often. But General Davidson was very clear on what happened in the later years. And the great thing about it was a triumvirate of some of the most superb public servants our country has ever had. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, in charge of the embassy for 6 years, and General Abrams in command of military forces, and William Colby in charge of support for pacification. A really great team. Thanks. Good question.
As a child of the Vietnam War, I have a question. My father was a combat engineer, and then later on in the late part of the war was with Special Forces and Delta Division.
Yes.
If you ask my father what happened in the war, he'll say it was political, and that's why we lost the war.
He'd say?
It was politicians, and that's the reason why.
All right.
How much of Westmoreland's was, the things he did, was based on political pressures, and how much was it his personal ego that caused that hurt?
See, that's a great question, too, but it's a really hard one to answer. As I said at the outset, he's a very complex man, and it's hard to understand. But it's very clear that he was driven by personal ambition, and as I've sought to illustrate, when he saw his interests at stake, he did not shy away from abandoning the truth. When he was coming back in 1967, making those optimistic statements that I told you about, it does not appear that he believed them, because in internal documents you see a much starker view of the state of the war. On the other hand, there's plenty of blame to go around. Time magazine sent me some interrogatories and invited me to answer them, which I did, and they posted them on their electronic website. I don't think they published them in the actual magazine. And forgotten what the first question was, but the second question, no, that's the second question. The second question was, do you believe in the subtitle, The General Who Lost the War? So do you believe the subtitle is fair? And I said yes, eminently. And then I described in some detail why I thought it was fair and where I wound up with, and this gets to your question of the outcome of the war. I said because this approach based on body count, where the enemy keeps replacing his losses, and so we're never getting any closer to any sort of victory, I said he squandered 4 years of support for the war by the public and the Congress and even much of the media. So that's the indictment that makes him the general who lost the war. But then the next question Time magazine said was, well, if you think the subtitle was fair, who were the co-conspirators and in what order of culpability? So I said, well, there are obviously at least three in the top rank. And I named Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara and General Earl Wheeler. And then I described why I thought each of them deserved to be at least in top rank of co-conspirators. And then at the end I said, if pressed, not everyone will agree with what I'm about to say now probably. I said, if pressed, I would say the most culpable was General Earl Wheeler. And then I put Lyndon Johnson and then McNamara, I think, although, you know, emotionally you want to put McNamara top, but I thought Wheeler really deserved to be it there. But back to what your father was talking to you about, here are the facts as I believe them to be. In this new approach to the conduct of the war, I described how Westmoreland's response to any problem was to ask for more troops. And he got them for a long time, you know, until 67 and then 68. So much so that at the high water mark, the authorization was 549,500 soldiers. Never really got quite to that level. We got to 543,400 at the end of April 69. He's gone by then, but they were in the pipeline because of his request. Abrams never asked for a single more soldier the whole time that he's in command. And just as we built up in earlier years, when Abrams is command, we build down in 14 successive increments, so that by the time we get to the big 1972 Easter offensive, General Abrams, this great tank commander for World War II, all he's got left to work with is air power and a little naval gunfire. But it suffices. And so the armed forces of Vietnam had by that time become pretty competent. Now you could talk to all kinds of people who say there was corruption, and there was inadequate leadership, and there was. I've edited a huge book about this thick of monographs written by senior South Vietnamese after the war was over. And I say in the beginning that traumatized as they were by the loss of their country, the loss of their homes, the disruption and relocation of their family, and all the things you know about, I felt they were far too hard on themselves. But nevertheless, they step up on these matters. But the fact is that they had a functioning government and a functioning army, and they were holding their own. We've all gone home at the end of March 1973 as a result of the Paris Accords. And they're holding their own until the Congress of the United States, in its wisdom, decides that even though all we're giving them now is money, we're not going to do that anymore either. And they radically cut back the allocation of funds. And at that point, it's over. It's over. I quoted Tom Polgar, a friend of mine, who was the chief of station Saigon at the last. And in one of his final messages, he said, this is a paraphrase, but it's pretty close. He said, outcome no longer in doubt, because South Vietnamese cannot sustain themselves without our help so long as the communists continue to get robust help from their sponsors, Communist China and Soviet Union. Polgar, chief of station, end of message. And that was right. So if you want to get right down to it, the instrument of our betrayal of the South Vietnamese was the Congress of the United States. In order to get the South Vietnamese to agree to the Paris Accords, which they saw as mortally threatening, they made no mention of the communists in the South Vietnam. They didn't have to go anywhere. But all the allies of the South had to withdraw. We had to withdraw, the Koreans, the Thais, everybody that was there helping them. And President Chu saw this, you know, this was going to be very difficult for them to survive under those circumstances. And Richard Nixon sent him assurance after assurance, letters, envoys. And they said, the president said to President Chu of South Vietnam, you've got to sign on. If you don't, the Congress of the United States is going to vote us out of the war. If you stay on, here's what we'll do for you. If there's renewed fighting, we will reintroduce military forces to punish the enemy's violations of the accord. He's talking about B-52s. Secondly, he said, if there's renewed fighting, we will replace on a one-for-one basis any major combat system losses you experience. That means tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft, as was provided for in the Paris Accord. So the Paris Accords contemplated the possibility of resumed offensive fighting. And thirdly, said Mr. Nixon, we'll guarantee you robust financial support for the foreseeable future. And I'm sorry to say that when it came to the crunch, we defaulted on all three of those commitments. And as Tom Polgar had said, game over. The only one, I'm prompted to add one thing that's not in your question, but it's very much in the front of my mind. In the last number of years, I've had the privilege, and I consider it that, of making quite a number of friends in the expatriate Vietnamese community, mostly in America. You probably know that at the end, we evacuated all the Americans who were left in South Vietnam, and 130,000 thought to be at risk South Vietnamese. And after that, many, many more came as boat people and under later programs called the Orderly Departure Program and so on. There are at least 1 million Vietnamese expatriates in the United States. There are more in Australia, Canada, France. I think those are the main places. And I would like to say to you that I am very, very proud of the Vietnamese friends that I have in this country. They have wholeheartedly adopted what we refer to as the American dream. They've worked hard. They've adhered to sound family values. They believe in education, and they've done extremely well. So even though they lost the war, many of them have remade their lives in ways that I admire very, very greatly.
Time for one more, then you have the last word.
Just wondering why Westmoreland was allowed to stay in Vietnam running the war for so long. 4 years seems like a long time when it's not going well.
That's a very good question and a good one to end on. I thank you for that. I thank all the questioners for very, very fine questions. The question this lady asks is, given his failure to produce, why was Westmoreland allowed to stay as the commander in Vietnam for such a long time, 4 years? And of course, that's a perfectly reasonable question. I did quote to you my friend, the late Russell Weigley's comment that no capable war president would have allowed a man of such limited abilities as Westmoreland to stay commanding there for so long. And I have wondered about this a lot too. I think there's sort of two sides to the answer. One side is that in the chain of command of people who had the authority to replace him, you've got Lyndon Johnson as Commander-in-Chief, Robert McNamara as the Secretary of Defense, and then the first military man in that chain of command, General Earl Wheeler, as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Lyndon Johnson had no background or experience in military affairs, nor, as far as I can tell, did Robert McNamara. So then you get to Wheeler. And General Wheeler is essentially a staff officer. Little command experience and none in combat. And so the first part of my answer is I conclude that these people who had the authority in the chain of command to replace him lacked the knowledge to do so and maybe the confidence to do so, knowing their own lack of background and experience. On the other hand, there are all kinds of people telling them that this isn't working, and they had every opportunity to conclude that maybe they should try something different. The most important person working that network of trying to persuade some change, bring about some change, was General Harold K. Johnson, who was for the same 4 years Westmoreland commanded in Vietnam. Johnson was the Chief of Staff of the Army. A man I admire extravagantly. As some of you know, I've written a biography of him as well. Under his leadership, I've alluded to this briefly, this proven study was done saying that Westmoreland's way was not working and that there was another better way to do it. But General Johnson's not in the chain of command. He's a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so theoretically he has some influence, at least to the extent that he can shape the collective viewpoint of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But he was not successful in doing that. General Wheeler adhered to the view that firepower was the major thing to be brought to bear in a counterinsurgency war. an absolutely, in my view, an absolutely ludicrous point of view. And this study was briefed around. General Westmoreland rejected it out of hand. Of course, it says what he's doing is not very effective, not at all effective. Some of you will know the name of Herb Chandler. Herb Chandler is a retired Army officer who later wrote some very good historical works, including a book about LBJ and the war in Vietnam, which is very worthwhile. Herb told me that when this Proven study came into the headquarters in McVee, he was the staff officer assigned to write the answer from Westmoreland. And he said, we all thought, meaning the junior officers there, we all thought this was great, but we couldn't say that. We had to say things like, well, there's some good ideas in here for study, and we're doing most of this already, and other things like that to get it put on the shelf. So there were people, lots of people, who were, at the time, were critical of the way Westmoreland was doing this. And so you'd have to say, somebody should have stepped up and said to the president that this has got to change. It's very significant, it seems to me, that not later than the autumn of 1966, the heads of the two services whose troops were doing the fighting in Vietnam, Army Chief of Staff General Harold K. Johnson and his soldiers, and Commandant of the Marine Corps General Green, what's General Green's first name? Wallace Green, thank you. They agreed that the way Westmoreland was fighting the war was not working, and here's really the kicker, they agreed that there was a viable alternative, what the Proven study had said to do. And yet they were powerless to bring about any change. I've just got to go on another couple minutes here, if you won't mind. This is a rich question, and there's a lot to be said to it. General Johnson was a man of unparalleled integrity and decency. And he was desperate to try to change the way things were going in Vietnam. He went out 11 times during the war, once while he was Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, and 10 times while he was Chief of Staff. And he told General Westmoreland on one trip, he said, we're now writing checks for $250 million a month for ammunition. That's $3 billion a year. And he said, the reports I get say that 85% of it is being fired on H&I fires, that stands for harassment and interdiction fires, and they're fired just on coordinates on the map or so on the premise that some enemy might be passing by and you would happen to hit them. And General Johnson's view was that, yeah, you might also happen to hit some villagers who were out there, and that would not be so good. So on the monetary grounds, on the military effectiveness grounds, and on the collateral damage grounds, he suggested to General Westmoreland that we ought to ratchet this back a little bit. Not 2 weeks later, Westmoreland sends a message to one of his principal sub-commanders, and he says, out here in the Seven Mountains region, he said, I think we should up the H&I fires by an order of magnitude, 100 to 200 rounds per tube per day. That was his response to the General Johnson's good suggestions to him. General Johnson wrestled endlessly with the question of whether he, as Chief of Staff of the Army, should resign in protest at the way the war is being conducted. And one of the major issues confronting him was Lyndon Johnson's refusal to allow the Army to call up its reserve forces. Every contingency plan we had for any kind of buildup of the magnitude required by the deployments to Vietnam contemplated call-up of the reserve forces, and Lyndon Johnson would not allow him to do that. In the period we're talking about, I don't know why this is. Somebody here might know this, but five-star generals were considered never to have retired. When they're too old to serve anymore, they don't get a new assignment, but they're on active duty. And one of those still living was Omar Bradley. and Omar Bradley had a little office in the Pentagon, and he used to come there sometimes. And General Johnson saw that he was maybe a little lonely there, and so he had a little coffee service put in there and so on. And then when he heard that General Bradley was in the Pentagon, if he could, he'd carve out a few minutes and go down and chat with him. I thought that was a very compassionate and also was very typical of General Johnson. But one time he goes down there and he has a serious matter he wishes to discuss, and he says to General Bradley how wrenching it is to him that he cannot get these reserve forces called, and that he's thinking maybe he should resign in protest. And General Bradley's advice to him went as follows. He said, no, he said, you don't want to do that. You'll just be considered a disgruntled general. You'll get one day in the newspapers, and then they'll get somebody else that'll come in and do what they want. You should stay and fight for what you think is right. And so General Johnson did that. And then, near the end of his life, and he told this to 3 different people, all known to me, all people in whom I have the utmost confidence in terms of their accuracy and their integrity. He said to them, I should have resigned in protest. I failed to take that action, and I will go to my grave with that moral lapse on my conscience. Now, I will say that I don't agree with that judgment, because by staying as he did, he tried to get Westmoreland to change the way he was fighting the war with the Proven study, and then, unable to do that, he tried to get him replaced. He sent General Abrams out there as deputy to Westmoreland. Abrams had been his vice chief of staff for 3 years. He said this was giving up my right arm. But he sent him out there, and very few people know what I'm about to tell you. It was understood that when General Abrams went out in May of 1967, before Tet, before a lot of the trauma that we've been talking about, he was going to take command within a matter of a few weeks. And among the persuasive evidence for the facts, for that being factual, he was allowed to choose his own chief of staff and take him with him. And he chose General Dutch Kerwin. And Kerwin rode out on the airplane with him. And they got to Vietnam. And Kerwin became the chief of staff, but Abrams did not become the commander until 13 months later. And on another occasion, I'll tell you why I think that happened, but in any event, he languishes there for this long period of time. And I have interviewed, Mike and some others here know this, I have interviewed over, I guess, nearly 30 years now that I've been interested in these matters, about 500 or 600 people, some of them over and over again. I suppose I interviewed General Bruce Balmer 30 times and talked with him informally 50 more times, or 100. And Dutch Kerwin the same way, and Fred Wyand the same way. I guess I'll just close by saying this. My strong conviction is about the war, it didn't have to end that way. Thank you all very much.